The crystal vase slipped from my fingers, shattering against the imported Italian tiles of my daughter-in-law's kitchen island. The sound was a gunshot in the stunned silence that followed Chloe's words, delivered with a saccharine smile to her circle of glossy-lipped friends. "Don't worry about that, everyone," she'd said, her voice a tinkling bell of condescension, as she waved a dismissive hand at the shattered heirloom. "It's just a little trinket from Liam's side of the family." She paused, her lips curving into a condescending smile. "They're from AA's simpler background. They don't really understand the concept of quality." My hand, still outstretched from where the vase had been, trembled. 20 guests at the baby gender reveal party froze, their gazes swinging between me, the 58-year-old woman in the sensible, off-the-rack sweater set, and my son's wife, resplendent in a designer silk kaftan. Chloe was 4 months pregnant, and this party, coming just a few months after their lavish wedding, was her latest production. As I stood there, the shards of my grandmother's vase glinting on the floor, I felt a pang of loss for the heirloom that had crossed an ocean to be here, now reduced to fragments that staff quietly swept away. My name is Evelyn Clark, but for the last 30 years, most people have called me Evie. I've spent the last decade perfecting the art of being pleasantly ordinary, a skill that turned out to be the perfect camouflage for what was coming. My son Liam had been with Chloe for 2 years. Married for 6 months of that. I'd met her a handful of times before the wedding stiff, formal dinners where she'd inquired, with faux concern, about my cute little rental cottage and whether my fixed income was enough to keep up with inflation. The wedding was a spectacle held at the country club her family had belonged to for generations. Chloe was a vision in lace that cost more than my first house. Liam, my sweet, serious boy, looked at her like she'd hung the moon. I'd worn a pale lavender suit I'd found on sale. Nothing to draw attention, nothing to embarrass him. I'd learned that the key to a peaceful life was to look exactly like what people expected to see, a retired widow, living quietly on her late husband's teacher's pension and a modest life insurance payout. The baby gender reveal was where the facade began to crumble. Chloe's parents, Barbara and Charles, had a home that looked like it belonged in an architectural digest. All sharp angles, glass walls, and cold, minimalist furniture. The party was a sea of tasteful beige and white, with a single pop of color waiting to be exploded from the custom-built cannon in the backyard. I'd been arranging the flowers I'd brought from my garden in the Vesmai vase, the one my grandmother had carried with her from Ireland, when Chloe had plucked it from my hands with a tinkling laugh. "Evie, that's so sweet, but let's use something that better matches the aesthetic," she'd said. And in the awkward transfer, it had slipped. Then came her comment, "They don't really understand the concept of quality." The room was a frozen tableau. Barbara's hand fluttered to her triple-strand pearl necklace. Charles cleared his throat, uncomfortable. But it was Liam's face that broke my heart, a flush of humiliation, quickly masked by a tight smile. "It was an accident, Mom," he said, his voice low, and then Charles spoke, his eyes, the color of chilled steel, narrowing on my face. "Evie Paws Clark," he murmured, a flicker of something recognition, disbelief crossing his features. "Wait a minute. Weren't you at the Strategic Partners Summit for Clark Educational Software last year, in Boston?" The air left the room. The name of the company, my company, hung between us. Foreign and terrifying in this context. Chloe's perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitted together. "Daddy, what are you talking about?" Charles Mitchell ignored his daughter, his gaze locked on me. "You were sitting in the front row. I remember because I thought it was odd. You were dressed simply. I assumed you were a board member's wife." But then they introduced the keynote speaker. Pause. Evelyn Clark, founder and CEO. A wave of murmurs swept through the guests. Chloe's smile had completely vanished, replaced by a look of bewildered suspicion as she stared at her father, then at me. The foundation of her perfect world had just developed a crack. The truth is, most people don't know what real success looks like. They expect power suits, a commanding voice, an entourage. They don't expect a grandmother who prefers gardening gloves to leather briefcases, a woman who drives a 10-year-old sedan and gets her clothes from catalogs. And that was exactly the point. It started with my late husband Arthur, and his passion for learning. He was a history teacher who believed every child could love knowledge if it were presented the right way. In our garage in the late 90s, he started tinkering with early educational software. It was clunky, all pixelated graphics and simple quizzes, but the heart was there. When he developed the prototype for what would become the History Horizons learning module in 2005, we thought maybe we could sell it to a publisher for enough to pay off our mortgage. We had no idea we were planting a sequoia. We didn't sell, we incorporated. Arthur was the dreamer, the educator. I was the engine, the business mind he always said I'd hidden behind PTA meetings and grocery lists. Clark Educational Software launched with that one module. By 2010, we had a suite of 12 programs in every subject, used in over 2,000 school districts across the country. The year Arthur died, 5 years ago, our revenue was just over $45 million. Arthur was my compass. On the day we signed the deal that made us millionaires, we made a pact over cheap wine at our kitchen table. We would tell Liam we were doing well, very well, but we would not burden him with the scale of it. He was 16, passionate about environmental science, and we wanted him to build his own life, find his own purpose, untainted by the distorting lens of extreme wealth. He never questioned it. He grew up in a nice, middle-class home, went to a good state college on a partial scholarship we quietly topped up, and believed his parents had built a successful, small-scale edtech business. What Liam didn't know was that the $45 million was just the foundation. After Arthur died, I couldn't let our shared dream die with him. I took the helm, not as a figurehead, but as a CEO. I streamlined operations, invested in a revolutionary adaptive learning AI, and pivoted to subscription-based models, strategic partnerships with major school districts, and international expansion into digital education markets fueled our growth. I didn't just run the company, I grew it. Last year, Clark Educational Software was valued at $950 million, the same company whose name had just been uttered in Charles Mitchell's stunned whisper. The irony was so thick, I could taste it. While Chloe had been patting my hand and offering me her financial advisor's number 4 when things get tight in retirement, I had been the anonymous majority stakeholder in the venture capital firm that had bailed out her father's floundering manufacturing company, Mitchell Precision Pots, 3 years ago. The same company he'd nearly run into the ground with outdated practices and stubborn refusal to automate. That venture capital firm, Ethelred Holdings, was a discrete entity I controlled. I'd invested not out of any personal interest in Charles, but because his company had a skilled, loyal workforce and a reputation for quality that was being squandered by poor leadership. It was a sound investment. Under the new management I'd installed, it was thriving again. The man whose daughter had just called me simple was living, quite comfortably, off my business acumen. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely a whisper, looking directly at Charles. "You must be mistaken." But we both knew he wasn't. I saw the memory clicking into place in his eyes. The boardroom, the quiet woman in the corner who'd said very little, whom he'd assumed was a minor shareholder or a lawyer. He'd barely glanced my way, focusing on the men in the room. Now, as Chloe stared at us, her confusion rapidly curdling into something else, I felt the walls of my carefully constructed ordinary life beginning to tremble. I muttered an excuse about the shock of the broken vase, and as I walked out, I felt the weight of 24 stares and the rising buzz of speculation. Charles's gaze followed me all the way to the door. The next morning, the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine from my garden did little to calm the storm in my chest. I was cupping my favorite chipped ceramic mug, watching the steam rise, when Liam's car crunched into my gravel driveway. He didn't even knock, just let himself in, his face a thundercloud. "Mom," he began, his voice strained. "What the hell was that yesterday?" He'd called last night, but I'd pleaded a headache, which wasn't a lie. The phantom sound of shattering crystal had echoed in my dreams. "Charles Mitchell pulled me aside after you left," Liam said, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "He was asking me all these questions. About Dad's company, about what you really do all day. He seemed to think you're some corporate titan." I took a slow sip of coffee. This was the conversation I'd spent a decade preparing for and dreading in equal measure. Liam had built his career as a sustainability consultant through grit and genuine talent. He'd bought his first home with Chloe with his own savings, proud of every penny. He lived a principled life, believing in the values of hard work and modest living that Arthur and I had modeled for him. How could I explain that while he'd been drafting environmental impact reports, I'd been authorizing acquisitions that affected thousands of employees, that while he'd been installing solar panels on his roof, I could have bought the entire solar panel company without blinking? "Liam, sit down," I said gently. Before I could form another sentence, my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Chloe. "Evie, we need to talk. All of us. Lunch at the conservatory. 1 p.m. I showed the screen to Liam. His shoulders slumped. "She was up all night, on the phone with her dad, looking things up online. She's obsessed." I think, I said carefully. Your wife has just discovered that the mouse she thought she was getting is actually a lion. What does that even mean, Mom? He asked, frustration etching lines around his eyes. Is there something you're not telling me about the money? Outside my kitchen window, a hummingbird danced at the feeder. Its life simple, its needs clear. I envied it. Everything, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I need to tell you everything. The conservatory was the kind of restaurant where the menus had no prices, and the floral arrangements cost more than my monthly utility bill. Chloe was already there, of course, seated at the best table in the house, a throne of velvet and mahogany. She wore a cream-colored sheath dress that screamed silent money, and her smile was a brilliant, practiced weapon. Evie, Liam, so glad you could make it, she said, air-kissing us both. Her eyes, however, were scanning me, taking in my simple linen trousers, and the single strand of real pearls Arthur had given me for our 20th anniversary, the same pearls I'd worn to the Ethelred signing years later. She'd ordered a bottle of Dom Perignon to celebrate, she chirped, though what we were celebrating was anyone's guess. This is lovely. Chloe, I said, settling into the chair that felt too plush, too enveloping, though perhaps a bit much for a Tuesday lunch. Oh, I think we have a lot to celebrate, she replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. Family revelations and all that. Liam shifted uncomfortably. Chloe, let's just talk. Of course, honey. She turned her laser focus back to me. So, Evie, I had the most fascinating conversation with my father last night. He's been telling me all about the corporate world. So cutthroat. He was particularly fascinated by the story of Ethelred Holdings. Such a mysterious firm. No one seems to know who the principal investor is. I took a small sip of the champagne. It was dry and exquisite and tasted like ash. Dottie said the investor is famously private, a ghost, but he remembers a woman from the initial meeting. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He said she reminded him of you. Liam's fork clattered against his plate. Chloe, this is insane. Is it? She asked, never breaking eye contact with me. She reached into her Birkin bag and pulled out her iPad. With a few taps, she brought up a digital copy of a Business Journal article from 3 years prior, about the Ethelred acquisition of Mitchell Precision Parts. There was a group photo from the signing, and there I was, on the edge of the frame, my face partially turned away, but unmistakably me, in a navy blue blazer, and the same pearl necklace. The resolution isn't great, Chloe said conversationally, zooming in, but the posture, the hair, the way you hold yourself, it's uncanny, don't you think? The silence at our table was a physical weight. Liam was staring at the image, his face pale. That's quite a coincidence, I said, my voice calm, isn't it? Chloe's smile was razor sharp now, just like it's a coincidence that my family's financial stability was secured right around the time this mysterious investor appeared, or that this investor has a pattern of investing in family-run businesses and turning them around. Liam found his voice, though it was shaky. Mom, please, just tell me the truth. I looked at my son, at the man I had lied to for his own good, and saw the trust we'd built over a lifetime beginning to fracture. Liam, your father and I, we built something much bigger than we ever let on. Chloe's triumph was a palpable force, but as I watched her preen, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The hiding was over. Now, it was time to see what happened when the lion was forced out of the tall grass. 3 days later, I was in the sleek, modern office of my CFO and most trusted advisor, Ben Carter. The lunch had ended with Liam walking out in a daze and Chloe making not-so-subtle hints about family unity and consolidating assets. Evie, this is a new one, Ben said, pushing his glasses up his nose as he stared at the financial profile of the Mitchell family I'd asked him to compile. Why the sudden deep dive into your in-law? Because I didn't realize when Ethelred bailed out Mitchell Precision that I was salvaging my future daughter-in-law's trust fund, I said flatly. Ben let out a low whistle, the one who married Liam. Yikes, that's a conflict of interest I didn't see coming. Tell me something I don't know, Ben. What's their actual situation? He pulled up files, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Okay, timeline, 2019, Mitchell Precision was drowning. Charles had taken on massive debt to retool his factory, bet on the wrong technology. By 2021, creditors were circling. That's when Ethelred stepped in. I remembered, it had been a solid company with bad leadership, an easy fix, and the family's position. I asked, according to the records, Chloe Mitchell was the golden child. being groomed to take over the company's marketing division. She got her MBA with a focus on legacy business management. The plan was always for her to step into a leadership role. When we bought the company and installed professional management, we didn't just save the business, we eliminated her designated future. The puzzle pieces were snapping together, forming an ugly picture. So, I didn't just buy a company, I bought her birthright, more or less, Ben confirmed. He pulled up another screen. And now it gets interesting. I've been tracking some discreet inquiries, high-level stuff. Someone is poking around the shell companies, the ownership structures of sophisticated poking. My blood ran cold. What kind of inquiries? The kind that suggests a professional, with legal backing, is building a case. Evie, I think your daughter-in-law has retained counsel and is doing her homework. A private investigator was one thing. A lawyer meant she was moving from curiosity to action. How exposed are we? Legally, rock solid. But a determined, well-funded legal challenge can create a lot of noise. It could force disclosures you've spent years avoiding. It could drag your name, and Liam's, through the mud. I thought of Chloe's determined eyes at lunch. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was a campaign. Your recommendation. Get ahead of it. If she's building a case for a financial claim, maybe arguing undue influence, or expecting a familial payout, you need to control the narrative. Don't let her expose you. He leaned back, his expression grave. But there's another angle, Liam. His reputation is built on his own merit. If this comes out, people will say his mother bought his success, his clients, his life. Every accomplishment he's ever had will be questioned. The breath left my body. I had hidden my wealth to protect him, to give him the gift of an unencumbered life. And now, the very act of protection threatened to destroy everything he'd built. There's more, Ben added, pulling up a final spreadsheet. The Mitchells' finances are a house of cards. They live on credit, leveraging their name, expecting a windfall that never came. And now Chloe thinks she's found it. In you. He didn't need to finish. The privacy I'd guarded so jealously, the normal life I'd built for Liam, would be obliterated. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, the weight of the decision felt physical. I was back at the same crossroads Arthur and I had faced years ago, but the stakes were infinitely higher. This wasn't about protecting my son's future anymore. It was about defending his past, his present, and his integrity from the woman he'd married. That night, I did something I hadn't done since Arthur's death. I went into the home office he'd built, the one I now used to manage an empire. And I pulled out the physical leather-bound ledgers from the early days. If Chloe wanted a war of attrition, she was about to learn she'd declared it on a general who had spent her life studying the battlefield. The numbers were a story of love and loss and relentless perseverance. Arthur's vision, my execution. The first $100,000 profit. The first million. The first 10. The grief after he died, channeled into work, into growth. The $45 million had become $100 million, then $500 million, and now hovered near $1 billion. But it was more than money. I held patents. I sat on the boards of 3 tech startups. I funded literacy programs in 30 states. I wasn't just a wealthy woman. I was a force in an industry that shaped young minds. My phone buzzed. A text from Liam. Mom, Chloe and I are coming over tomorrow night. She has a proposal about how we move forward as a family. I didn't laugh, but the irony was a bitter pill. She had a proposal. I had no doubt it involved spreadsheets, fiduciary responsibilities, and a seat at a table she had no right to approach. I pulled up the legal documents Ben had sent. The Mitchells' situation was dire. Their multi-million-dollar home was a collateralized asset. Their investment accounts were skeletons. Charles's consulting fee from Mitchell Precision, which I had generously approved, was their primary source of liquid income. Chloe hadn't married my son. She had married what she thought was his proximity to a safety net. And now that she knew the net was a trampoline that could launch her back into the stratosphere of wealth, she was going to jump. The next evening, Liam and Chloe arrived at my cottage looking like a united front, but I could see the fissures. Liam's posture was stiff, his smile forced. Chloe was all business, in a sharply tailored dress, a leather-bound portfolio under her arm. Evie, thank you for having us, she began, her voice smooth as silk. I think it's important we approach this new dynamic as a family. She made herself comfortable in my favorite armchair, as if claiming territory. What did you have in mind, Chloe? I asked, settling onto the sofa beside Liam. She opened her portfolio. I've been doing a lot of thinking. When there's significant family wealth, it's crucial to have structures in place for protection, for growth, for legacy. I remained silent, letting her lay out her play. I've drafted a preliminary proposal for a Clark family trust. She slid a document across the coffee table. It would consolidate assets, provide tax advantages, and ensure that the family's financial future is managed collaboratively. I skimmed the first page. It was exactly what I'd expected. A trust with a board of trustees, herself, Liam, and me. Democratic oversight, as she put it. That sounds very formal, I remarked. Well, with the scale of what we're dealing with, formality is protection, she said, her eyes gleaming. An initial funding of, say, $80 million would give the foundation immediate credibility in the philanthropic community we'd want to engage with. $80 million? From the woman who'd called my grandmother's vase a trinket. Liam looked horrified. Chloe, that's insane. We're not talking about Mom's life savings here. Exactly, Chloe said, her gaze never leaving mine. We're talking about so much more. I set my tea down. Chloe, can I ask you a question? Of course. Do you love my son? The air crackled. Liam flinched. Chloe's smile tightened. What kind of question is that? She asked, a flush creeping up her neck. A simple one. Do you love Liam for the man he is, or for the access you think being his wife provides? The mask shattered. How dare you? I dare, I said quietly, standing and walking to my desk, because I have a responsibility to my son. I picked up the folder Ben had couriered over that afternoon. This is a record of your activities over the past 3 weeks. You're retainer of Blackwood & Associates, a firm that specializes in corporate asset tracing. Your consultations with the law firm of Hartman and Reed, who are known for their work in inheritance and wealth disputes. Liam was staring at his wife, his face a mask of dawning horror. Chloe, you hired lawyers. It's not what it looks like, she insisted, her voice rising. I was trying to protect us, to understand. You were building a case, I corrected. I pulled another sheet from the folder. And you've taken out 2 new lines of credit in the last month, totaling $150,000. You're financing this investigation on the assumption of a massive return. She was scrambling, her composure gone. This is about family, about making sure we're all on the same page. Whose page, Chloe? I asked, spreading the financial documents Ben had prepared across the table. Because according to this, your family's ship is taking on water, and you see my son as a life raft. I pointed to the figures. Your parents' house is leveraged to the hilt. Their investment portfolio is a ghost town. Your father's comfortable retirement is funded by a consulting contract I approve every year. Liam was reading the documents, his hands shaking. Mom, how can you know all this? Because, Liam, when someone declares war on your privacy, you do reconnaissance, and what I found is that your wife didn't just marry you, she acquired you as a strategic asset. The silence was broken by a single, choked sob from Liam. He looked at Chloe, and the heartbreak in his eyes was a physical pain in my chest. What happens now? He whispered. I looked at my son, at the good man caught in this gilded trap, and I made my choice. Now, I said, my voice firm, we find out what everyone is truly made of. The following 2 weeks were a tense ceasefire. Liam moved into a hotel. Chloe's communications ceased, which I knew was the calm before the storm. She was regrouping. The storm hit on a Tuesday. Ben called, his voice tight. Evie, we have a problem. Someone has filed a formal complaint with the state's attorney general's office. They're alleging potential conflicts of interest in the Ethelred acquisition of Mitchell Precision, suggesting the primary investor may have used insider information. My stomach plummeted. She hadn't just hired a lawyer, she'd gone nuclear. How solid is it? The allegations are baseless, but they're sophisticated. She's claiming you had knowledge of the Mitchell family's desperation, gained through your personal relationship with Liam, and used it to secure the company at a predatory valuation. It's a stretch, but it's enough to trigger an inquiry. A formal investigation could take years. The publicity alone, it would shatter the normal life I built for Liam. My phone rang. It was Liam. Mom, he said, his voice hollow. Chloe's filed for legal separation. Of course she had. It was a strategic move to protect herself financially from any potential fallout from her own complaint. While positioning herself for a divorce settlement from a now verified ultra-wealthy family, I met him at my cottage. He looked shattered. Her lawyers cited irreconcilable differences arising from fraudulent family representation and potential financial entanglements, he recited, as if reading from a script. He looked at me, his eyes full of a pain so deep it stole my breath. Did you do this? Did you want this to happen? The accusation was a knife to the heart. Liam, I wanted you to see the truth. I never wanted your heart to break. By destroying her, by investigating her like she was one of your corporate rivals, by showing you who she was before you had children with her, before your lives were irrevocably entwined. I took a steadying breath. Liam, there's more. Her legal complaint has triggered a regulatory investigation. He stared, uncomprehending. What does that mean? It means the woman you married is willing to burn down everything I've built, and your reputation along with it, to get what she wants. The silence, stretched, thin, and fragile. Finally, he looked up, and I saw a glimmer of the strong man I'd raised. What do you need me to do? The meeting was held in Ben's starkly modern conference room. It was a tableau of hostility. On one side, me, Liam, Ben. On the other, Chloe, her lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Mr. Davies, and her parents, Charles and Barbara. Barbara wouldn't meet my eyes. Charles looked both furious and ashamed. Let's be perfectly clear, Mr. Davies began. Mrs. Clark has engaged in a prolonged pattern of deception while leveraging her financial power in a manner that has directly impacted my client's family. This creates a strong appearance of manipulation and potential misconduct. Ben responded with cool professionalism. Mr. Davies, Mrs. Clark's financial activities are legal, ethical, and entirely separate from her personal life. Your client's complaint appears to be a retaliatory measure following the discovery of assets she feels entitled to. Chloe leaned forward. This isn't about entitlement. It's about fairness. Evelyn has been pulling the strings of our lives from the shadows. I finally spoke. Chloe, I invested in a failing company and saved it. I've lived my life privately. I've manipulated no one. You let my father think he was a failure. She shot back. Your father was failing as a CEO, I replied evenly. I saved his company and the jobs of everyone who worked there. Without me, Mitchell Precision would be a memory. Charles Mitchell cleared his throat, his face ruddy with embarrassment. Evelyn, I am grateful for what you did for the company, but this secrecy, while being so close to our family, it feels like a betrayal. Strategic, Charles, not deceptive. You never asked, and I had no obligation to tell you about my personal finances. Mr. Davies slid a thick folder across the table. We have evidence of a pattern of control. The consulting fees, the timing of business decisions, the surveillance of my client. It paints a picture of someone who enjoys pulling the strings. Evidence of what, exactly? Ben asked calmly. Of a successful businesswoman managing her investments. Mrs. Clark doesn't control your client's family. She has no fiduciary duty to them. But she does to her son, Chloe interjected, and she's failed him by her deceit. Liam, I said, turning to him, what do you want? He looked at Chloe, his expression a mixture of love and profound disappointment. What do you want, Chloe? What will end this? She exchanged a glance with her lawyer. A formal, legally binding family financial agreement. A trust, shared governance, transparency. Mr. Davies elaborated. We're proposing a structure where Mrs. Clark contributes a significant portion of her assets to a trust managed by a board comprising herself, Liam, and Chloe. It ensures collective decision-making for the family's future. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the ant-like people below, living their uncomplicated lives. I have a counter-proposal, I said, turning to face them. The room stilled. Chloe, you have 48 hours to withdraw your regulatory complaint and cease all legal and investigative actions against me. In return, I will provide you with a one-time settlement of $8 million. Liam gasped. Mom. I pressed on, my voice cold and clear. In exchange, you will sign a comprehensive agreement never to contact my son or me again. The marriage will be annulled. The silence was absolute. Liam stared at me in stunned disbelief. 8 million, Chloe repeated, the words a whisper. That's correct. Mr. Davies was already doing mental math. It was a clean, generous payout versus a messy, expensive, and uncertain legal war. Double quotes Mrs. Clark. That's a generous offer. But it seems designed to dissolve a marriage, he said. Mr. Davies, I replied, the marriage was built on a false premise. I'm offering to pay for a clean, quick demolition, instead of a long, collapsing ruin. Liam stood up, his chair scraping loudly. Stop. Just stop. He looked around the room, his face a mask of disgust. You're all sitting here negotiating the price of my life, my marriage. Isn't that what it's always been? I asked softly. He turned to Chloe, his voice cracking. Chloe, just answer me. Did you marry me for me, or for this? He gestured at the documents, the lawyers, the money. The silence lasted a full 30 seconds. It was the most honest answer she could have given. 8 million, I repeated, my gaze locked on Chloe. And I'll ensure your parents keep their house, and your father retains his position. You sign, and you walk away from my family forever. And if I refuse? She asked, her voice small. I smiled then, a real, genuine smile. Then, you get nothing. Your complaint will be investigated and dismissed. Your parents will lose everything, and you will be left with nothing but legal bills and the memory of the life you could have had if you'd just loved my son for who he is. Mr. Davies was whispering frantically in Chloe's ear. The math was undeniable. A guaranteed $8 million versus a Pyrrhic legal victory. I need to think, she stammered. You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow. As the meeting broke up, Liam lingered after the others had filed out, shell-shocked. Did you just buy my wife off? He asked, his voice hollow. No, Liam, I said, my heart aching for him. I just gave her a choice, and in doing so, I gave you the truth. He was quiet for a long time. What if she takes it? Then you'll know, and you can begin to heal. And if she doesn't, then you'll still know, and I will make sure she never harms you or anyone in our family again. He looked at me, a strange mix of fear and awe in his eyes. Who are you? I thought of Arthur, of our garage, of the dreams we'd built together. I'm the woman who built an empire to honor your father's dream, and I'm the mother who will tear it down to protect her son. The next day at 4:52 p.m., Mr. Davies called Ben to accept the offer. The papers were signed by midnight. Chloe took the $8 million and vanished from our lives. Liam filed for an annulment the following week. The pregnancy, I learned through the legal channels, had been terminated shortly after she received the settlement. She had chosen to end it, a decision that left Liam grappling with the loss of a future he had begun to imagine, a pain that cut deeper than the end of their marriage. 6 months later, he called me. Mom, I met someone. Her name is Anna. She's a botanist. She thinks my mom being a retired teacher who gardens is the coolest thing ever. He paused. How does she not know? Because, sweetheart, that is the coolest thing I am. The rest is just what I do. I could hear the smile in his voice. We'd like to come for dinner on Sunday. But, Mom, can you just be you? The you who taught me how to weed a garden and value what's real. I looked out at my garden, at the vibrant, messy, beautiful life I had cultivated with my own hands, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Of course, Liam, that's the only me there is. And for the first time, I knew it was the truth. Your story matters. If you've ever had someone underestimate your strength, I'd love to hear about it in the comments.